Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape 538, and it's March 28th, 1982. I have two apologies to make. One, I caught a cold last week, and so my voice is very hoarse. I'm just lucky to be able to be on the air. And secondly, we did have trouble with the patch cord at the radio station that goes into the cassette machine. It happened the week before last for those of you who subscribed to the tape, so the second half of the tape is not clear, but we didn't get it caught up. We didn't understand that there was a problem until it was too late to do something this past week. I had to go to Los Angeles early Monday morning and didn't get back till Saturday evening last night. So I'm doing that broadcast over for you, and for those of you who take the tape cassettes or for the other radio stations. We don't have too many problems like this, but they do come once in a while, so you'll just have to be patient with us and do the best. We're doing the best we can, and as I say, these things do happen once in a while. You can't tell when you're on the air live that it isn't recording into the machine, and it's usually tested before it goes out. There was a very important story in the New York Times, March the 4th, 1982. It was very important for many reasons that I'm going into in detail, but a subscriber to the tapes in New York noticed the article. I take the New York Times, and the edition that I had in California didn't have this article, and in addition to not having it on the West Coast, it was not picked up by the other newspapers that I take. I haven't seen it in the wire services. It was a special to the New York Times by John Vinocur, Vinocur. Did not go over the wire services and was not in any of the other newspapers I saw. Now, what is this important story? The lead article, the lead title is Bonn Investigates Security Official. Magazine said he persuaded the CIA to have Nazi papers in the United States suppressed. Now, this article is about a man named Hans Langemann, Langmann, and I've seen his name somewhere in books or articles about Nazis or Nazi officials. It rings a familiar name, but I can't locate it yet in my library, and many of the books are not indexed. The article says West German security official Hans Langemann was ordered to be investigated by the current government in Germany because he was a person who exposed to a newspaper in Germany about the suppression of Nazis in the German government, and the CIA and the National Archives in the United States helped suppress the fact of high-level Nazis, members of the Nazi Party in government in Germany, and also their cooperation with Richard Nixon and the cooperation of the National Archives to hand over volumes of documents out of the archives of the Nazi connections that were in the United States, 58 volumes of material. Mr. Hans Langemann arranged with the CIA to suppress these documents, not in Germany, but in the United States. He flew to the United States at the time that Chancellor George Kiesinger became the Chancellor of Germany. That was just before Helmut Schmidt. Chancellor George, spelled without an E, Georg, Kiesinger, Kiesinger. The West German Intelligence Agency, and this is also the network set up by Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, wanted to recruit an agent of influence, according to this article, to lead President Nixon to think favorably about West Germany. Well, I have a long list that I'll read off of connections of Richard Nixon to the German Nazis. I don't mean the Rockwells, the American Nazi Party, although he was linked to those people too. But the real Nazi, the real hard Nazis that we were supposed to be fighting in World War II. And when Kiesinger became the Chancellor of Germany, Nixon became President of the United States, and the two of them were going to have a working relationship of a former Nazi member with a man who has worked with Nazis since the days that he ran against Jerry Voorhees to become a member of the House of Representatives. The 1946 elections, he went into the House in 1947. Hans Langemann, the department chief in Bavarian Intelligence Ministry, worked for their intelligence agency from 1957 to 1970. Remember, Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 after Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy had been murdered, in case you don't recall the overlap of these dates. Gehlen headed the agency for the Hitler's Nazis, who formed our CIA originally, And this man who broke the story for a magazine called Konkret, Konkret, in Germany, was suspended Tuesday, March the 2nd, as a security officer in Germany because he broke the link of the Nazis to Richard Nixon and to our National Archives in Washington, D.C. Jürgen Saupe, S-A-U-P-E, the author of the article in Concrete, was being investigated to see if he should be under criminal indictment for disclosing state secrets. The fact that Nazis have worked with the United States before and after the war is not a crime. To divulge them is the crime. There were tape recordings made, 8 cases of tape recordings, in which Langemann says he was involved in making these arrangements. In 1968, when Nixon was elected to office, Langemann was an intelligence agent, and he wanted to stop a series of possible disclosures of journalists of the relationship of the new president, Chancellor of Germany, and the new president of the United States to German Nazis and war criminals. So he went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., to see if they would pull out the information of Mr. Kiesinger's links to the Nazi Party and his membership in the Nazi Party. Richard Helms, the former director of the CIA, who was in Germany during the Nazi era and saw Adolf Hitler in line with his journalism work and so forth, Richard Helms was the former director of the CIA. He met with Mr. Langemann on February the 2nd, 1968. That's just prior to the Robert Kennedy murder in June, in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Langemann asked Helms, don't release the documents of Kiesinger, the Nazi. Now, Mr. Helms directed Mr. Langemann to a CIA expert by the name of Mr. Hart. And I'm going to get to Mr. Hart in a minute because it's unusual for a journalist in the New York Times, such as John Vinegar, to not put the first name of Mr. Hart. He can say Mr. Richard Helms, the CIA director, and he identifies other people by the first name, or Mr. Hans Langemann, but it's interesting that he doesn't use the first name of Mr. Hart because that is terribly important to the story or the possibilities of the story. Even though it is a big story without mentioning him, it's even more important if we know which Mr. Hart. Now, they go to the National Archives. Mr. Hart is a CIA employee described as their Nazi expert. They plan to destroy or lose the documents. Destroying them would be out of the question, they're told, but it could be arranged so that finding them could be made practically impossible or extremely difficult. I might say that when the 26 volumes of Warren Commission hearings and evidence and exhibits were put in the National Archives, they were arranged in such a way that it made it impossible to retrieve a lot of them, and they weren't indexed also. Now, what they would do is take the guide to the films, the microfilms, and take them into a special place, the microfilm archives, so that it would be extremely difficult, practically impossible, as I say, to get these. Now, Mr. Hart of the CIA, working with Richard Helms, the Nazi expert, turned over 58 volumes of the so-called guide to German authorities. Now, I wonder if they were worrying if Robert Kennedy became president of the United States, because he was shot the night of his primary in June when he won the California primary. If Robert Kennedy would have gone into the Nazi connections of the murder of his brother and the role that maybe the Mr. Hart that I'm thinking of had a role with Lee and Marina Oswald and Yuri Nosenko and John Paisley. Were they sending Mr. Langemann to the archives to retrieve papers of Nazi connections solely because the Chancellor of Germany was a Nazi, a member of the Nazi Party, or to get close to Richard Nixon, or they were retrieving these at that date, February the 2nd, 1968, because Richard Helms met with Mr. Langemann on that date, and Richard Nixon wasn't even the president. If you look at that date, as explained by the New York Times, Mr. Langemann said in 1968 the intelligence agency wanted a series of possible disclosures by journalists of documents from the National Archives that would tend to discredit Mr. Kiesinger, who was a member of the Nazi Party. So he came to Richard Helms on February the 2nd, 1968, and that was just 3 months before Robert Kennedy was murdered. But Mr. Hart was the man who was the Nazi expert, and yet, as I say, he isn't identified. The article goes on to say that Mr. Hans Langemann, chief of the Bavarian Interior Ministry from 1957 to 1980, which might also explain the stopover of Lee and Marina Oswald in Eastern Europe and Brussels and coming to the United States through those countries, working with these people, was there information in there on George de Mohrenschildt and Mr. Kiesinger and the Kennedy assassination that they wanted to get rid of before the former Attorney General Robert Kennedy became president, and many people thought that he would possibly go into his brother's death that would lead to Reinhard Gehlen, the CIA, and a Mr. Hart and a John Paisley and Navy intelligence. Now, they received 58 volumes from our CIA of the Guide to German Authorities to Conceal the Chancellor of Germany, George Kiesinger, was a member of the Nazi Party. Now, who else was in there? Henry Kissinger was soon to become Secretary of State or the head of the National Security Council under Richard Nixon. He had strong ties to Nazi Fritz Kramer, and Alexander Haig was a protege of Fritz Kramer. The chief of intelligence under Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific was a German, and how many Germans in the State Department were working their way up, just like needles that get in your foot, that break and get in the bloodstream and come out of other parts of your body. These broken needles from World War II were seeping out. So thanks to the CIA for hiding these Nazi members, keeping them in the National Archives, sending a letter to Mr. Hart, and then they continued that they wanted to get an agent of influence close to Richard Nixon. Now, John Kennedy is dead. He's been killed by Nazis with connections down to Martin Bormann in Argentina and the Alexander Zeiger family in Argentina at the radio factory in Minsk, where Lee and Marina were introduced, that I've alleged for many, many years with the Nazi connections, and George de Mohrenschildt and Walter Dornberger out at Bell Aerospace. All of these Nazis from the Kennedy assassination could surface with a proper investigation, and they want to be close to Richard Nixon because he's going to be the president. Now, he isn't president until 1968, and it was several months before Robert Kennedy was assassinated. But they wanted to get close to Richard Nixon and Mr. Kiesinger, and Richard Helms, the former CIA director, was working on that project. The German intelligence agency also arranged to get an agent of influence close to Mr. Nixon, who came in 1968. Mr. Langemann said, we want to get close to Nixon to reach Nixon with German points of view, which is comical, as if he didn't have them. The sense of the whole operation was to reach Nixon from a friend with deep ties and financial relations. And I.G. Farben and the German banks do have deep ties and financial relations with the entire Republican Party and Spiro Agnew, so that Mr. Langemann was active in getting these volumes from the National Archives and making a close bond as soon as Robert Kennedy was murdered and his Kurt Kiesinger of the Nazi Party became the president of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany. Now, several days after that article, March the 18th, 1982, over the wire services of the New York Times, a little short column, Bonn security aid is seized after disclosures on secrets. The first article said that they might prosecute him, and now from Munich, Germany, there's an article in the New York Times. The federal police arrested a security official today who reportedly leaked the secrets involving President Nixon and Chancellor George Kiesinger to a left news magazine. Now, it doesn't really matter whether it's left or right. They have to throw that in, as if some leftist wants to discredit a Nazi Party member with Richard Nixon, who could come to the National Archives that we pay our taxes to lock up. Interesting next paragraph. A spokesman for the prosecutor's office says Hans Langemann, a top security official in the Bavarian government, was the chief of security at the 1972 Munich Olympic Games and was the police guard in Munich. Now, I can't say how many times or broadcasts. You'd have to have a complete series of my tapes or listen to my broadcasts for years to know that I said continuously that the Munich Games, where the Jewish athletes were murdered, was set up by the Central Intelligence Agency. Now it seems that the chief of security for the Munich Games is the same man who is making contacts for the Chancellor of Germany with Richard Nixon, and this was a very important move. The Munich Olympic Games was the catapulting of international terrorism, so we would have more Interpol, more police. more people guarding the going in and out of countries, and to create the terrorist organizations that the CIA had set up by George Corcola, Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, to have an excuse for infiltrating any leftists under the guise of the terrorists. These same persons who sent me the article about the New York Times article on Langeman sent me just the most recent on Carlos, March 13th, 1982, the New York Post, Carlos the terrorist. It says, Carlos is the man behind the Gaddafi security force. Now, Frank Turple has been saying all along he's worked for the CIA up to April of 1982, but this article is on Carlos the terrorist, who's been linked to the PLO, the Italian Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army, the German Baader-Meinhof. He's also said to have planned the barbaric massacre of the Israeli athletes in 1972 at Munich. If he planned the barbaric massacre, the chief of security was the man that came to the United States. I have another article, many articles on Carlos. One, Jack Anderson, September 23rd, 1980, a year and a half ago. The jackal is saved by the CIA. In the wilderness of mirrors that make up espionage games, the CIA conspired to save the life of the world's most notorious terrorist, Carlos the Jackal. And it goes into the stories of Carlos and his activities and where he worked and how the CIA came in and spared Carlos, and that he works with Condor Nations, that's Operation Condor, the assassination teams coming out of South America. In 1974, entered the CIA into the PLO, the Japanese Red Army, the Israeli hit team, the assassinations. It goes into all the little terrorist things they did, including the massacre of the Israeli athletes. And Jack Anderson said in 74, the CIA, through the assassination squad of the six-nation concentratorium of South American dictators, known as Operation Condor, was ordered to kill Carlos. But I guess they wanted to wipe him out, such as the Martha Mitchell, Dorothy Hunt wiping out, or Mr. Williams, the investigator from Air Florida, and the Tampa scandal down there, that I have more to update for you later on that. But here is Carlos being saved by the CIA, linked to the mafia, and Jack Anderson had a long article about Carlos and his role in various violences and his role with the CIA. So I have, maybe 40, 60, 80 articles on Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, Carlos, the Munich Olympic Games. But at the time that the Israeli athletes were gunned down and taken out of the athletic housing where they stayed, I knew immediately, the way they got over the fence and in there, that the security had, if they gave them the key, they didn't have to do any more than give them the key or just look the other way to go over the fence. So now the man that works with our CIA, with Mr. Hart, with Mr. Richard Helms, and our National Archives was the security chief, and that was a very big thing for Richard Nixon in 1972 to catapult the terrorists, the terrible terrorists, so that he could pull some more Reichstag incidences. Now, last week I was talking about my article, The SLA is the CIA, and mentioned that Kronholm kidnapping in Minneapolis that I linked to the FBI at the time Patty Hearst was kidnapped. And that's the fellow who received the silencers for the man that just did decapitations and cut off the hands in a double murder out here in Santa Cruz, about an hour away from Carmel, Monterey area. And he also did a murder of a security guard up in Oregon, and another murder in Minneapolis. And I did a little bit on him. I'll do more later. But in that same article, The SLA is the CIA, on page 38, I wrote about the Munich Games and the massacres under the section Indication that the SLA is part of a large-scale national conspiracy. And in there, point 11, I said, the Olympic Games massacre of Israeli athletes in Munich, Dr. Hacker and the SLA. The massacre in Munich was wide open for the investigation of a larger conspiracy. And here is this Cookie, being the chief of security there, Mr. Langeman, okay? I said that it involved the United States and German military police, and it's the German military police that was out here in our National Archives. Arab terrorists, in quote, kidnapped the Israelis after the German police watched them climb the fence. That's the security of the Olympic Games, okay? Dr. Frederick Hacker, an expert on terrorism, wrote a book deploring violence and guerrilla movements, but he never mentioned a secret fund behind the Arabs or elaborated that it was the Germans and Americans who murdered the Jews and not the Arabs. Hacker was a consultant to the Los Angeles Police Department. He became Donald DeFreeze's psychiatrist when DeFreeze was working as a police informer before he kidnapped Patty Hearst or was allowed to walk out of Vacaville prison, again about 30 miles from here down the road near Monterey County. It's right in this area. And DeFreeze went right up with the group that were going to kidnap Patty Hearst. I wrote, when Patty Hearst was kidnapped, Dr. Hacker moved in to become Randolph Hearst's advisor. He became the expert. He catapulted into fame an expert on terrorism after the Munich Olympic Games. We create the situation, then we create the professionals. He worked with the Los Angeles Police Department with Donald DeFreeze before he went to Vacaville for the mind control job. And then he is the consultant to Randolph Hearst while his daughter is kidnapped by the CIA. I had figured that as a setup of the CIA a long time ago. Now, getting back to Mr. Hart, on the testimony of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and I did tapes going back to 1979, that was already 3 years ago, January the 19th, 1979, broadcast 372 and 370. You can get those tapes if you want, and 379. I talked about a John L. Hart, who went before the House Select Committee, who was associated with Yuri Nosenko, a man who allegedly was a KGB defector who was from the Soviet Union that I said was the Nazi connections to Lee and Marina Oswald in the Soviet Union. Nosenko defected to the United States in April of 46, months after the Kennedy assassination. Mr. Helms, who was director of the CIA, and Alan Dulles, the former director, was on the Warren Commission, did not tell the Warren Commission about Yuri Nosenko. John Hart and John Paisley both worked with Soviet Union CIA counterintelligence, and I said that Nosenko was the man who could have arranged Mr. Zeiger's moving to Minsk from Argentina and back to Argentina after Kennedy was murdered. Mr. Nosenko is now living in North Carolina, the constituency and area of Jesse Helms, and I'll go into that. He has a new identity and lots of money. And a week after Mr. Hart testified, John Paisley died. John Paisley had direct connections to that notorious Nugan Bank that I refer to all the time on these programs, the Bank of Heroin, CIA, Southeast Asian money. The money poured into that bank after John Kennedy was murdered and the war escalated in Southeast Asia, and the intelligence agencies took over the large influx of drugs and coming out of Southeast Asia and then into South America afterwards. That you can get those tapes, but John Lyman, Lymond Hart, and Catherine Hart worked with him. She was the wife of CIA agent John Hart. She was CIA also. She was the superior of Mrs. Paisley. There were four people: John Paisley, Mary Ann Paisley, whose attorney after her husband was killed was Bernard Fensterwald of the Committee to Investigate Assassinations, who's worked with the CIA clients most of his legal career. So the two Paisleys and the two Harts were very much involved in CIA stations and clandestine operations and money overseas. They could be the ones to send the money to Lee Harvey Oswald to get to the Soviet Union, to return when he wanted the money, no debts, and have the mobility to travel and get the safe houses and the introductions in the Dallas-Fort Worth area set up by Nazi criminal George de Mohrenschildt. So the question remains, is this Mr. Hart, described in the New York Times article by John Vineker, and I'll write to him, as I say, I was going all last week, the same Hart, and if it is, then he is purposely hiding the name John Lyman Hart because it became known to some American people at the time of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I had said, it was 2.5 years ago, that the committee cut short with the possible links of organized crime to the Kennedy assassination, but had a long way to go up to the Heydrich connections, J. Edgar Hoover, the Nazi connections, the Argentine connections, the Minsk, and so forth, and that a German, Otto Winneker, sent the historians to write the Warren Report. They have a lot of Nazi in the archives that they can get 57 volumes out just before Robert Kennedy is to become president. So it certainly makes a lot of difference who this Mr. Hart is. And again, in 1979, March 79, I did a review of a book, Treason for My Daily Bread, of the high-level link of Nazis involved in the Kennedy assassination. And this is a very good book to get if you don't have it, Treason for My Daily Bread. And it's important because here is Richard Nixon, now president, with strong Nazi connections to Nikolai Maloxa, to the Dornbergers, to the aerospace people, to all of the intelligence operations, and also to Joe McCarthy in the House Un-American activities. He was active in prosecuting Alger Hiss and setting up the Cold War anti-communist scare directed by Nazis from Germany. That's another subject I go back to and back and forth and do much more later on Joe McCarthy and his role in rescuing Nazis from trials in Europe and putting them back into power in Germany. So this Mr. Kurt Kiesinger, the chancellor, and Richard Nixon in power, the chief of security over there being the chief of security for the Munich Games. And as I say, I mentioned these people as being instrumental in the Munich Games affair, and that they let these people jump over the fence, which they actually did. And I think it's scandalous because one area covers another area, so that this poor fellow is being charged for revealing the information not mentioned in the United States about who in the National Archives releases 57 volumes of Nazi connections. When people like myself put reference to Nazis involved in overthrowing this country or taking it over, and there are many fine people doing research on that subject, we get the argument, where's your evidence? Well, more and more it comes out that the evidence is locked up or thrown away. It's deep sixed and denied. And the burden of proof is on us. Well, the proof that they were in power and did the things they did is available with their record to see. There is a book, Bormann Brotherhood, by William Stevenson, that has the references of Mr. Kiesinger and his close association to the Nazi Party while he was Chancellor of Germany and the very top Nazis he was in. There's another book, Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, by Paul Manning, a current book, that has many references of Kiesinger, George Kiesinger, and his role with the Nazis and his ties to I.G. Farben and the Nazis. This is documented in a lot of books. I just mentioned two of them here. Many of you have them or you can get them, and it's good to have them because you can look up these names when news stories come out like this and see where they are today and what power they have to suppress the information that's coming out. That's important. How do they get the power to go to our National Archives to suppress this information, and who are they hiding it from while they keep getting elected into office and making decisions that they're trying to push us into World War III? I hope my voice isn't too harsh for you. Some man called me. I might have mentioned it recently on one of the programs. He was in Carmel area, and he called me, and he said, I have trouble listening to your tapes. And I said, why? And he said, your voice is so scratchy. And I said, well, I can't help that. I said, there's nothing I can do about that. That's my voice, and that just is a condition that has to be, sort of like a Julia Childs of the conspiracies, okay? People listen to her voice while they make puddings and pies and so forth, but this happens to be my voice. And he says, well, the tapes sound just like this. He says, the way you're talking now is the way it sounds on the air. And I said, well, you're talking to me, and that's the way I sound. I might mention on this cassette that the doctor that did surgery, I had 2 surgeries on my vocal cords, but it was a long time ago, and the last surgery was about 27 years ago. But the doctor who did both surgeries was Dr. Joel Pressman, and he was married to Claudette Colbert at the time and before, and for a long, many years. And that's the actress that Ronald Reagan is spending his Easter vacation with, Claudette Colbert. Joel Pressman was a throat surgeon, and he did the work at UCLA. And I was left, luckily, I was left with a voice, but there were nodes on the vocal cord once and then twice. And I tried to take care of my voice in between radio work. I don't always, but it does have that scratchy sound, and now it's aggravated by a cold. So we'll have to live with that. I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and then we're going on to another subject, not unrelated at all, that was in a newspaper this last week, the Nazi legacy, military might in Latin America. And it goes from the Nazis in Latin America and the brutal killings and the quartering of people and dismembering and so forth, then to the role the CIA took to continue to train the police to do the work, so that the CIA and the Nazis were one. The Nazis formed the Central Intelligence Agency, but when it came to repression and bloodbaths, they become more overt, and the links of the intelligence community to the Nazis is being exposed. But the fact that the intelligence community was formed by Hitler's chief of intelligence is only in a few isolated books, and people as yet have not been able to make a connection of the oppressions and genocide going on to the very fact that it never stopped. We give people different names and agencies, but it's still the same group doing the murder of native populations. And on the other side of this tape, I'll go into the Nazi legacy in Latin America. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is the second side of tape 538, March the 28th, 1982. A long article by Charles Macheline Jr. from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He wrote this article for the Los Angeles Times. As I say, it's titled The Nazi Legacy, Military Might in Latin America, and it's also a full three-quarter page story in the San Jose Mercury, March 21st, 1982. El Presidente is saluting in a uniform, and he has a gun in his hand, and he's got dollars in his pocket. The article says, briefly, the brutality of military culture in the former Spanish colonies is almost inconceivable by the Anglo-Saxon standards, and shows up its worst in El Salvador and Guatemala. And it cites statistics in 2 years in El Salvador, 25,000 people have been killed in crossfire. Not only killed in combat, but they were tortured, mutilated, butchered in cold blood, and every night men and women are dragged from their homes by armed men. Mutilated corpses turn up on the roadside ditches. In the last 60 days before the election, 400 to 800 villagers have been massacred. In Guatemala, whole villages of Indians, spectrum of intelligentsia, journalists, teachers, social workers, students, doctors have been killed in political violence. These atrocities are not just tragic byproduct of a civil war. They are not accidental. They are not understood by the American public, and they are concealed by the Reagan administration. And the fact is that the Latin American military in Salvador, Guatemala, Argentina, it doesn't even mention Chile, was devised not only by the Nazis, but earlier by the Spanish and carried on by the Nazis, perfected in Argentine. Latin military staffs involve torture and murder of anyone suspected of even associating with subversives. Guilt or innocence is immaterial. The object is to exterminate the opposition by cowing the sympathizers into submission, deprive the guerrillas of support. The brutal military tradition was handed down from the savage conquistadors, and the dictators took over. They've been a plague on the people ever since. Then it goes into the fact that the Americans, for 20 years, the Pentagon has lavished training and equipment on the Latin American military at the bases in the United States and the United States Army School of the Canal Zone under the guise of civic action. We've trained them. We have not weeded out drug racketeers and war criminals. And it goes into the fact of since World War II, these people have acted worse and are indistinguishable from the people, the criminals that were hung in Nuremberg. They not only were indistinguishable, but only a fraction were hung, and the rest are out doing the same thing in South America. They left easily, went down there, and people like Joseph Mengele from Auschwitz was living, people like him, he and others were living in Germany, enjoying German life, getting back into official positions of police, government, intelligence, security, and were never published, nor were the people who carried on the orders for them in the concentration camps or made the gas. Corporations like IG Farben, they get promotions, such as Mr. Peter Grace, who works with Otto Ambrose, the chemist of the extermination plans, and top Nazis have continued. They have never been punished. They've been respected. And the point is that the CIA, as I say, was formed by them, by the Nazis, and until, if I have to repeat this every week until people get into their heads, we had no CIA intelligence until the Nazis came to this country and told us how to pattern it after the Gestapo. And after The agreement was made to form the CIA. Harry Truman was shocked and said directly, "We have a Gestapo in this country." This article goes into the United States that led, allegedly, a crusade against Nazi evil and now supports the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads, and that's an outrage. Now, the only way of exterminating American Indians or Indians in Chile or in Peru or in Brazil or in Paraguay or all of South America is to sterilize them, which is happening now, and give them poisons and diseases. We are eliminating the Indian population from the globe. Maybe in 20 years there will not be native Indians in North or South America. And the point is that the poor Indian cannot speak for himself. So who is being killed? The politician or the educated Indian who wants something better for his mother, his family, his brother, himself. It's the people working their way up in the system who are having their heads cut and arms cut off and their entrails cut out, just as the Tsarists did to the Jews at the time of pogroms and so forth. And Hitler did, breaking into homes and having the terror that he spread around. Now, I mentioned Mr. Grace. There's one person who wanted to stop the appointment of Grace for this position that Ronald Reagan has put him in. I mentioned that position as chairman of the Presidential Study Group, and Mr. Grace has been a partner of Otto Ambrose, who devised the slave labor camps. He also worked very hard with the poison gases and the slave labor, and worked with the overthrow of Allende down in Chile. And now he knows how to take care of our poor and our uneducated and our masses in this country. And Ronald Reagan has sent him to take care of the private sector survey on cost control, which means how do you cut out giving money to the blacks and the poor while we get our cost overruns. Representative Tom Lantos, a Democrat of California, urged to stop the appointment of this Mr. Grace to this position, but I do not see any other newspaper except it was the B'nai B'rith Messenger in Los Angeles had an article about the Nazi role. We saw articles about the Nazi role of Mr. Grace with Otto Ambrose of IG Farben, but I haven't seen any other public officials trying to stop the appointment. And along with J. Peter Grace, who's chairman of the Grace Company, works with the Flick Group and IG Farben, the chemical group. They're just practically one organization with three different names. Along with that, as director of that group, as the president named James W. Nance to assist Mr. J. Peter Grace in this job. Now, Mr. Nance was a deputy to Richard Allen when Richard Allen was being investigated for his Japanese connections. I saw a picture of him over in Japan again this week, all smiles still. This Mr. Nance was in the Navy, and he was an aide to Senator Jesse Helms. Senator Jesse Helms is the gentleman from North Carolina, who one of the few in the Congress who has been objecting to the Genocide Treaty ever since he's been in public life, that he doesn't want the Genocide Treaty signed, which means that the anti-genocide resolution is something offensive to him. This came up after he was first elected into the Senate, and he not only has links to a lot of Nazis and the Nazi and the Klan in North Carolina, his benevolent state, but he is against the Genocide Treaty. And now the admiral or the Navy commander who was the aide to Mr. Senator Helms is going to be the assistant with J. Peter Grace, and the beat goes on and on. Now, I mentioned the provocateur element in the SLA story, and there's a direct parallel to what was going down in El Salvador. And I might have mentioned this before, but I don't think I went into the details of this story. It was from the Baltimore Sun and from the Washington Post, and again, not a wire service story. So many of you who hear these broadcasts don't get these in your local newspapers if you're not tapped into those papers. The story title reads, Salvador Ransom Kidnap Ring, Rich Playboy admits heading the Salvador group. Now, the gist of the story is that a group of very wealthy people, including a man who's a security guard for Bayer Aspirin, which is IG Farben, and for Nestle's, and many of you know the story of the Nestle's milk formula and the holdings of that Swiss chocolate company. The guy who sets up security for these firms kidnapped a member of a wealthy family down in El Salvador And then he goes to the family, puts them in a high-rise apartment with all kinds of contacts, and goes to the family and tells them how sorry he is and asks for a $5 million ransom has been asked for this person. And he's with the person who's kidnapped, and he's with the family who's supposed to give up the ransom, but they don't know it's the same person that's doing all this. The story goes San Salvador. Discovery of a wealthy playboy posing as a revolutionary to commit kidnapping suggests that criminal opportunities may be taking over where the guerrillas left off in El Salvador. Mr. Roeder, a 35-year-old former Army major, admits leading a gang who kidnapped two of his wealthy friends, Mr. Bustamante Augsburg in December of 1981 and Roberto Seaman in September 1980, and wanted $5 million. Roeder, a well-connected playboy, travels continuously between Miami, was president of the Salvadoran Institute of Industrial Promotion in the 1970s during the regime of President Molina. Until his arrest in January, he also headed the largest security firm guarding executives from companies like Bayer, Aspirin, Bayer Chemical, and Nestle's of El Salvador. Now he goes to the families, and the article says instead of a sleazy guerrilla hangout, the police found Bustamante, the man who was kidnapped, in a swank apartment filled with an arsenal of weapons, linked with Roeder's officials here in Miami. They had a telex machine, a two-way radio transmitter, closed circuit television, closed circuit. I call it a circus because that's what it is, television, and they are keeping this person who's kidnapped instead of being mistreated or tied up in an apartment. And then they go, the kidnappers, to the family and tell them how sorry they are and how badly they feel. Now, that's exactly what I wrote happened at the SLA, where wealthy people, Emily and William Harris, with college degrees, and Angela and Gary Atwood, come out from Indiana and get involved with Donald DeFries, who's an intelligence agent working with the LAPD, their CIA counterintelligence group, and they kidnapped heiress Patty Hearst and let her watch television at Disneyland and kill a few people in Los Angeles and carry on a 2-year story as an excuse for SWAT teams to come in, to find terrorists, to create terrorism, to identify the so-called left in the Bay Area, and comforting Randolph Hearst and Catherine Hearst while they all along know where Patty Hearst was. This is exactly what was happening, and this is continuing to happen, because if there are no genuine guerrillas, you have to keep doing this in order to keep the guerrilla story going. And Mr. Cummings, who was one of the few Jewish appointments of Ronald Reagan to the ambassador to Vienna, put him in a strategic place where, he could be blown up easily. Another terrorist story would be, over the news media, and you could wipe out your Jewish ambassador at the same time. Or they could use him to antagonize the Soviet Union, because through Vienna, Russian Jews were coming, and instead of going to Israel, where they promised the Russians they would go, they're siphoning them in the United States for anti-Soviet propaganda. Well, Mr. Cummings had a heart attack in January and came home from Vienna, and he was at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, and my family said, promise you won't tell. Of course, couldn't put on the radio. He was there, and he was home for a short time. It was a big secret that the ambassador to Vienna was at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles since January, and nobody in the news media or other people could be told that. Now, if it was really a heart attack, it seems to me that everyone would know how he is and want to know how he is. And Mr. Cummings died this week of cancer. He just died while I was down in Los Angeles this week. I was down the time that he was admitted to the hospital. And so now he has his 2 or 3 months, maybe his Jack Ruby or Martha Mitchell cancer. Now the Jew is home from Vienna. And the conversation is there. It's really good that he was back in Los Angeles, because the terrorists would have killed him there, that he had 20 guards and a bulletproof car and his life was in danger and he shouldn't have been there, the terrorists. Terrorism is the conversation, not the links. Washington Post, New York Times, Time Magazine, the links of the terrorists to the CIA or the Jack Anderson syndication that comes out with the CIA protecting the terrorists. Those people who want to believe it hang on to the thing that the terrorists are the baddies, even though there are direct links to the intelligence community. So there's an article in the LA Times this week that Mr. Cummings died in Los Angeles from cancer and not from a terrorist in Vienna. And the beat goes on and on. There is nothing to keep conversation and lips going back and forth and to find a terrorist. So that down in El Salvador, a group that are in charge of security for the multinational corporations and the IG Farbens and Bayer and Nestle's and 98 other companies that aren't even listed. You can imagine what the others, a total of 100, are if Nestle's and IG, Bayer Aspirin, are two of his clients. So he takes the member of the wealthy family, puts him in a high rise with all kinds of entertainment, tells the family how sorry he is. Maybe they get the $5 million that they can't get out of the country, and then go to Miami and parlay that $5 million into cocaine from Colombia and make $25 million. So they can keep a member of the family locked up and have $25 million for weapons and guns to fight the native population, all under the guise of helping find the ransom money would put out for this person, and all the time he's safe in a high-rise apartment. The whole thing is so disgusting, but it has a pattern, and it repeats itself over and over. And as I said before, the shocker, or it's no shocker, of a man coming from Vienna and Munich intelligence to make a rapprochement with Richard Nixon, with his links to the Nazis, when George Kiesinger is the Chancellor of Germany, is another repetition of a sad story. This just came out in the New York Times in March of this year, that story that I did so much about on the first half of this tape. But remember, in 1972, the summer of 72, when I wrote Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, it goes into the warfare state, into John Foster Dulles, into the use of Reinhard Gehlen, into the Nazis, into the German specialists, the Cold War, J. Edgar Hoover, and their Nazi connections, and their use of Richard Nixon for their front man. All of that I knew 10 years ago when I wrote that article, and now the documents are coming out how they all cooperated. In 1968, February 68, why Lyndon Johnson was still president when the archives were emptied of these 57 volumes of indexes with the CIA. We didn't even yet have Richard Nixon as a conduit or connection. So it's a continuous process. It isn't Republicans and it isn't Democrats. It's a question of fascists who want to maintain a status quo order of control over the economy and the labor market without competing or giving fair wages, and exterminating those people that they think are ugly or deformed or unusual, and using people as you do vegetables in a wheat patch or cornfield. People are treated as vegetables, and of course they seem to like it. They get themselves plowed and seeded and plowed and put into cans, and they dig their own cans or make their own jars or whatever, and they seem to enjoy it. So I only simply describe the situation, not the cure. The San Jose Mercury this last Sunday had a front page story, Hitler's Alive and Other Conspiracies, and the magazine section has a 4-page section on Mae Brussell. And those of you that subscribe to the World Watchers and take these tapes regularly, I'll send you out a copy of this article. As I say, I was away last week, but I will have copies made and send them out to you because many of you don't get the San Jose Mercury. The front page of the magazine section is Mae wearing her shirt that Rush Hart made for the researchers who killed JFK, RFK, MLK, and MJK. MJK was Mary Jo Kopechne, who was murdered so that Ted Kennedy would not be able to run for president, and they would link him, and that wasn't far to do, to her demise at Chappaquiddick. Big title, Hitler is Alive. The federal government killed John Lennon. Ronald Reagan is a front man for the forces of evil. If you don't believe it, just ask Mae Brussell. And there's an account, Jill Wolfson came to the house, and she came down on a Sunday afternoon and wanted to go to KLRB with me, and was there when I did the broadcast, and then she came and spent the night and left the next morning, and it sounds like we're sitting there just eating a lot of meals. She writes it in it. I don't know. I can't be objective about these kind of things. I think it's a fairly good article. Every time I read articles about myself, or most of the time, they don't really say, if you wanted a point to be made, to be remembered about you, to people who don't know you, what would you want and how could you support that information? What is it you're doing and why are you doing it? It isn't a bad story, and it did make the front page of the San Jose Mercury Sunday paper and the front page of the magazine section, so it called attention to World Watchers, and the gist of the program was about World Watchers. And I'm going to do many tapes in the near future on the Dutch resistance, the battle at Malmedy, the Battle of the Bulge, the betrayal at Arnhem that I refer to from time to time. And in this article, she said, getting a fix on the number of bona fide world watchers is like asking a government official how many central military advisors there are in Central America. Well, many people want to know who's listening to the radio, who gets the cassettes, how many go out. To tell you the truth, I don't have the faintest idea. We make the tapes, as she said in the story. We have some duplicated. We send to people, and they have them duplicated. And there's people that will tell you that have this program on other radio stations, and I think they tell me about 17 times a year what the call letters are and want me to remember them and write them down. But that isn't my role. My role is to do research and get it out to you and study. And it's interesting if people call in a certain city and say, where can I find this program? But it's more interesting for them to really search for it and get the material and books. I don't want them to work for it, but there's a lot you have to do yourselves, and it's not part of my mentality to keep remembering. All I do is answer the mail I get, and it comes from many, many states. You'd be surprised how many, and people asking for the sheets that go with the tapes, and I just don't even want to estimate. I want to see when I'm completed with 1 week's broadcast, see what's the most important thing for you the next week, the week after, to keep you on top of these stories. And finally, to conclude, there was an interview with Mr. Malle, M-A-L-L-E, regarding that movie, My Dinner with Andre, and I mentioned it briefly before. Why did I like that movie so much? I believed it should have been nominated for the Best Picture of the Year because it's about two people, whether, as I said before, there's an alienation there, there's an estrangement, but there's an effort on one person to get through, to communicate, to tell what he's doing, to share his ideas. It may not be that he's doing it successfully, but he's making the effort where one is enthusiastic. And Malle directed the movie Atlantic City also. I didn't see that, but I saw this one. And he says it's unbelievable. This is one of the quotations from this story. It's unbelievable that a movie would be made of a conversation piece, that there's just two people that come into a restaurant. He says what's amazing is that people go back and back to see this movie. Nobody in his right mind can come up with an explanation of the success of this thing. I could give you a lot of good reasons why it was not going to work. A friend of mine came up with the explanation that there are a lot of people out there that aren't capable of making conversation themselves anymore. I call this the television age, of course. If they ever could, they can't now. So it is a great relief for them to go and pay their money and sit and listen to a conversation. An old friend from years before comes in and has dinner with another friend, and one's 10 years younger, and they work together in the theater. They have their dinner and they leave. But they have a conversation, and that's the entire movie, except for a waiter that comes and takes the order, brings it, and clears the table. And he said if this is the case, we'd have a whole series of sequels of conversations. Malle says it could become a cinematic genre of the conversation piece, that's part of a discussion. The movie says people don't have time. They go home and watch television, so the art of conversation is lost. I'm curious to see what it's going to be like when the movie is on television, because then you can bring your TV dinner and sit and have dinner with Andre when they bring it to television, so that these two men, Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory, are having their dinner, and you can eat your dinner and just sit and listen to them talk. And how many times have you been somewhere where two people are talking and you're just listening to them talk, and the conversation is out of your realm, but either one of them interests you and you're there? Well, why am I so fascinated with this particular movie and bring it up several times on this program when there's so many earth-shaking things going on? I think because when the program first started, it was called Dialogue Conspiracy. And people said to me, well, it's not a talk show or a call-in show. Where's the dialogue? And I said, you are supposed to take this program and take notes before I had the tapes or lectures that I do or the articles I've done. But the radio program, it's going on 11 years, and the tapes have been available since 1977, and the reels have been right from the beginning. You're supposed to play them with your friends, and then you have a conversation. If you read a book that's interesting, you should have a conversation with people. If you hear something on the news, You have a conversation, whether Mr. Doge was kidnapped that day or whether a house burned down, a bathhouse in San Francisco, and different people persecuting the gays around the country in the bathhouses, or whatever it is you're interested in. You have conversations. There's newspapers on ecology. There's movements to stop nuclear weapons and so forth. So you're supposed to take these broadcasts and listen to them and talk about them. If you think the material is too controversial, then you probably won't listen again. If you think there's a grain of truth, you might listen. But I hope that there is this dialogue, because the kind of people I'm trying to reach are not the ones that are sitting and watching television on Sunday night or the radio programs. They're not listening to KGO or Call Things. They're listening to Mae Brussell share many books that you can talk about, many movies you can talk about, many dictators you can talk about, many countries that are being overthrown, tortures, mind control, so forth. The role of Nazis since before Hitler came to power on up to the present day. There are a lot of subjects, so you're not limited to one, but at least have a conversation about it and have some concern about it. And it may not always work. You may be with people who aren't interested, and you'll have to find other people who are. Now, that book, My Dinner with Andre, it's out as a book. I was going to go to the movie and tape record it and type it up for you, but it is out as a book, and you can get it. Grove Press. It just came out because many of you don't have the art theaters in the towns where you'd like to see the movie. And after they keep talking, Andre is filled with enthusiasm. He's searching all over the world for the meaning of life. He hasn't found it yet. And the real tragedy is that the meaning of life is in the history that we are giving, that he is giving to his daughter, Marina, or to his son. The real life is what we do with those that are next to us, Nicholas, his wife, Chiquita, and so forth. What kind of a world is Andre going to leave to them? That is very important. He isn't concerned with that. He's concerned with them in a sense, but he has to find something for himself. And Wally is just sitting there, listening to him, and he's not connecting. And any of you who take this research seriously, or listen, as I say, want to connect with people who probably have the same response as Wally until you go out and find someone else, because they are out there. I know they are, because the only people I see are the friends I have, except for a few old-timers, are those that have connected to certain truths that are making the world a worse place, and to certain truths of people that are trying to make it a better place. And in the script of this play, in this movie, after Andre's done most of the talking, and he talks to Wally, marvelous person, they're real friends, they're not actors. He says, well, Andre, if you want to know my actual response to all this, do you want to hear my response to what you're saying to me? He says, well, Andre, my actual response is I'm trying to survive, I really am trying to earn a living to pay my rent and my bills. I love my life. I enjoy staying home with Debbie. I'm reading Charlton Heston's autobiography, and that's that. Occasionally, maybe we step out, go to a dinner party, and I have a list of errands and responsibilities, and I keep a notebook, and I enjoy going through my list and carrying out the responsibilities and doing the errands and crossing them off my list. And I don't know how anybody could enjoy anything more than I enjoy reading Charlton Heston's autobiography. And I don't think I feel the need for anything more than all this. Now, the tragedy, of course, is that Wally is happy with what he's got. He's got the bestseller. He says, I don't even know what you're talking about. I know that what you're talking about, but I don't really know what you're talking about. Actually, even if I did feel the way you do, there's no possibility for happiness now. I couldn't accept the idea that the way to make life wonderful would be to totally reject Western civilization and fall into a belief of some weird thing. He says, I don't even know how I'd go about it. And the point, getting back to this character, Wally, is that he makes his list and he reads Charlton Heston. But then someday he has to take his list and read about Walter Dornberger, or Kirk George Kiesinger, or Joseph Mengele, or Martin Bormann. And he has to learn about the Gestapo and the SS. And he has to make his list of gas mask, shovel, food supplies for survival, burial place, will, last wishes, etc., etc. His list either changes drastically or it never changes, and then all he has to do is to just take off his clothes and go for a shower, and that's the end. They pulled the plug, and he's had what he thinks is his shower, and then they bring in the man who yanks the gold out of the teeth and cuts his hair for pillows, takes the skin for lampshades, and that's it. Some people are just meant for that role of doing what they want to do and staying at that level until the end comes, sweetly or cruelly. And there are other people who want to change those things that happened to people in the past and don't want to see them happen in the future. And there's people like Andre who want to change all this but haven't found the answer yet. They're still searching. They're off somewhere. Now, do your conversations, meet your people or family members, talk about these things and have a dialogue. And the less tube, the better. That's what it's about. And see if we can't solve some of these problems before this planet is totally ruined. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. It's time to close now. I'll be back with you next week. Take care. And I'm sorry about the delay in the tape this week.